I'm Charlotte McLeod with investingnews.com, and here today with me is Andrew Chanin, CEO of Procure ETFs, which is the issuer of the FIXT ETF. Thank you so much for joining me. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Great to be back.
Really good to be speaking with you, and we're going to go in a little bit of a different direction today than we usually go on our channel. But I think the topic is going to be of interest to our audience. So just for some brief context, the FIXT ETF tracks companies that are involved in natural disaster preparedness and recovery. So we're going to go into what exactly that means in just a moment. But to begin, I thought you could just give me an idea of how this ETF began. What was the thought process behind creating it?
So the concept of a natural disaster focused fund is something that's been on my mind for many years. As a student in university, I was actually in New Orleans, Louisiana, during Hurricane Katrina. And that has been something that's been on my mind since. And when starting my first ETF company, I was in New York City right as Hurricane Sandy came pushing its way through. And the idea of creating a financial vehicle that invests in companies that help aid us and protect us and help us recover from natural disasters was something that was very near and dear to my heart. And so, many years of research and working to try to determine the types of companies, technologies, industries, services that are related and critical to the theme of natural disasters was something that we have finally encapsulated into this concept of the FIXT Procure Natural Disaster Recovery Strategy ETF.
Really interesting to hear that personal connection there. Thanks for going over that. I also want to get some background information on the cost of natural disasters. So the fact sheet for the ETF had some stats that I thought were pretty eye-opening. So if you could just go into that and tell me what that looks like.
Yeah, so what we've seen over the last several decades is that natural disasters are something that they're not going away, and for many reasons, particularly just the value of assets and properties that people possess. When natural disasters happen, the costs become seemingly more devastating from a financial toll. While fortunately we've been able to do some more things that have probably lessen the human toll of some of these disasters, the financial toll seems to continuously be growing. One of the stats that I think is extremely interesting is about 2 Aprils ago, the White House came out with their own report, believing that by the end of this century, the cost to the U.S. federal budget from natural disasters and climate change alone could reach roughly $2 trillion per year. And when you start to extrapolate that out to what those costs would be for other countries around the planet, as well as for individuals and for businesses, those numbers could potentially be significantly higher than just that calculation to the U.S. federal budget costs. And so, when looking at that, a theme that looks at companies that are helping us on the preparedness side becomes very important. And I think the same adage that you hear with healthcare and in other areas of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure is something that seems to really be true. And what we've seen for this fund is a collection of companies that help before, during, and after natural disasters. So really something looking at the full life cycle, which are the various areas that are currently what we deal with from natural disasters. And when we look at potential costs and damages in the future, it could be a way of looking at how to address investing in this not even an emerging theme, but one that seems to be continuously growing as a risk for people, and one that many people don't have different financial tools to potentially be able to hedge or get different exposures to this theme.
So yes, as you say, this is absolutely massive, and I'm sure there's many companies involved at those 3 stages. So what I was hoping you could do is talk a little bit more about those 3 stages and maybe mention some of the fund's top holdings across each of those categories.
Absolutely. So when you look at the preparedness side of the equation, typically you'll look at companies that are involved in construction, consulting, engineering. So when a company is building out a massive new facility, when a municipality is building a new convention center or looking at its existing infrastructure, there's a lot of analysis that goes into building out infrastructure these days that take into account certainly sustainability and how eco-friendly they are, but also realizing the real risks of potential natural disasters. And back when people started developing on the coastline here in the United States and Canada, many people would look at 10 years, 20 years, 50 years worth of historical flooding and sea level issues. And now they're saying maybe 100 years is more accurate. So taking into these varying and all different types of natural disasters and how you can better build to take into account these potential risks. So some of these companies would even be a company like an NVIDIA, which actually helps for modeling and looks at where potential natural disasters can come from, how it might affect certain areas. So working with these various technology companies, a huge construction consulting engineering company like AECOM, which takes on massive construction builds for as a multinational company around the world, and looks at navigating some of these potential risks. Then you get to the actual natural disasters themselves, and something that really impacted New York City as well as your native Canada was the Canadian wildfires that occurred this summer, and that's something that most Canadians are pretty familiar with as a seasonal type of natural disaster. But the smoke effects reaching the eastern seaboard of the United States and New York City was something that many people weren't that familiar with. And you have companies like a Babcock International, which make the helicopters that are used for firefighting, and also training personnel that can help tackle some of those during the disaster types of scenarios. And then what happens after the natural disaster passes? Well, in some cases, you have issues with dredging, and you need to rebuild dunes along the coastline, which is something that Great Lake Dredge and Dock actually helped assist New Jersey rebuild over a dozen miles worth of coastline after Hurricane Sandy came through. So there's all different types of natural disasters or different types of things that you can do from a preparedness front, different things that you can do during, and certainly rebuilding after a natural disaster is very important. And on kind of a more individual consumer side, we also have those companies like Home Depots and Lowe's that consumers may go to help rebuild their homes after a natural disaster has passed. So as you can see, some of these companies might specialize for numerous types of natural disasters. Some may have even more singular focuses on specific types of events. But many of these companies are operating in the United States and North America, as well as multinationals and even foreign companies comprise this basket.
I think that was a really good overview of just the breadth of companies that you're looking at and how many different industries are involved in this. So I wanted to ask, are there any other criteria that you look at when you're adding ETFs or adding companies to the ETF?
Yeah, so it's not a requirement, but many of these companies do have or have had within the last 5 years contracts with government agencies like FEMA that specialize in helping with disaster assistance and recovery, or other foreign entities similar to a FEMA. There's also ways for companies that help create things like backup energy sources, such as a Generac, which helps, which sells generators around the world. And then also water technology companies are something that have become very important. So not only is it for monitoring purposes and transportation of water, but also different technologies to make sure that you have clean water. One thing that many people don't consider is after a hurricane, the flooding can bring so much debris, and companies that help purify the water, or companies like Clean Harbors, which comes in and removes hazardous waste and toxic chemicals and things like that, are companies that could be absolutely critical that many people don't necessarily think of initially when thinking of natural disasters.
Yeah, I would reiterate again, many companies that you're mentioning that make sense, but I wouldn't have thought of them initially. So really interesting to hear about. So the ETF launched all the way back in 2022. So definitely there's been some time to gauge its performance. And it's actually up, I think, about 20% since inception. So definitely the trend is upward there. I wanted to ask though, have you seen it move up and down in conjunction with natural disasters? Is there any trend that you can mark there?
I think it's going to vary depending on the types of natural disasters that we see. But during its the short history of the fund going back to we had actually launched it on the official start of Atlantic hurricane season 2 years ago. So on June 1st, we have seen numerous natural disasters. We've seen one of the most devastating earthquakes in the last few decades occur across Turkey and Syria. We've seen tremendous amounts of wildfires. We've seen drought. We've seen the first major storm hit the Pacific coast just several months ago in Mexico. And some of these are predictable, some of them aren't. But the one event that seemed to bring a lot of attention to these companies was actually the event of the Canadian wildfires, where we saw a tremendous amount of media coverage, but also on financial news networks looking at the impact, and actually telling people in real time kind of what they're going through, what they need to do to prepare themselves. And many of these natural disasters are only a couple days where they get coverage on financial news networks. And the Canadian wildfire seemed to be one that captured a lot of interest, and possibly that could be some of the reason that we saw an increase in demand for our fund at that time.
Well, and unfortunately, from what I hear, it looks like we're probably heading toward another bad wildfire season coming up in 2024. One thing I wanted to ask, it feels to me that natural disasters, we hear more and more about them, and it's just really in the media. We're hearing the headlines all the time. Is there a trend toward we're actually seeing more of them, or is that an illusion and it's more just, the news cycle is so much more present now?
Yes. So the way that many people try to track natural disasters over a time period is looking at what they call $1 billion events. So events that cost over $1 billion in damages. And that seems to be kind of a pretty well covered topic there. And over the last several decades, we've been seeing a tremendous many more of these events occurring. And so that's something that I think insurers look at heavily. And we've seen new types of vehicles be come about to try to address things like this. One extent that I think has grown in popularity have been catastrophe bonds, which are something that looks at natural disasters and trying to find ways of funding to better be prepared for these types of events. And so I think there are potentially more tools. But then you have issues where you have certain insurers leaving states that are higher risk and flood areas and wildfire areas, and trying to carve out those specific areas because they are such high risk. So one of the reasons, though, as we mentioned, why you're seeing these high dollar amounts associated with natural disasters in many cases can be attributed to just the increase of wealth of the global economy. And you look at an area like South Florida, and you've had tremendous amounts of investments made, second homes, third homes, tons of people moving there after the pandemic really started perking up in the United States. And because you have so many assets and wealth that are now in these different areas that are at high risk of natural disasters, when these events do occur, it's not that surprising that you're having an increased amount of damages associated with it from a financial term.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The other thing I wanted to ask, so as we mentioned, the fund launched back in 2022. I'm curious about the amount of interest that you're seeing from investors, if people are looking at it and getting involved in it. Obviously, I think that people will be able to see the value proposition here, but then there's also the angle where, you're essentially making money when bad things happen. So I wonder if there's any hesitance connected to that you see.
Yeah, it's tough to say. I don't believe that the companies in here are exploitive. In the United States, there are very firm rules about price gouging, and when you have natural disasters, you aren't just allowed to just start jacking up the prices on things to take advantage of that situation. These are companies that are, and to the extent that people are viewing it as, cheering on bad things, I think it's quite the opposite. These are companies that should be championed. They're the companies that are helping us prepare for, these natural disasters. They're helping us in the middle of natural disasters, providing equipment and personnel and expertise to help us weather those storms. And then they're helping us rebuild our lives after natural disasters. So I really do believe these companies are ones that should be championed and not demonized or vilified, because they play a critical role. And, for these companies to have a strong standing, to be well capitalized, to be able to raise money as needed, that's, potentially going to help their ability to, to weather storms as well and be there when we need them the most, whether that's their ability to go out and invest in creating new facilities and factories to produce more equipment, for them to invest in technology to better help analyze for these types of, pending threats. To the extent that they're better positioned, capitalized, and strong standing in the capital markets, might actually help us. So I think it's really important that these companies are viewed in this light and not as ones that are necessarily opportunistic. That said, for someone that is going through a natural disaster, if they are invested in companies that are actually performing, hopefully that's some type of protection that they may be able to receive if that event does occur. So we're looking at different tools that we can help provide investors to exposures that they might not be having. And if you look at the holdings of FIXT, there's very little overlap with other funds out there, whether that be an infrastructure, whether that be a climate change fund. You have many people investing in ESG related strategies because they believe that they're going to make the world a better place. This isn't billed as an ESG fund or an ESG strategy, but this looks at the real world scenario. Natural disasters do happen, and these companies, in many cases, help us. And I kind of look at it as, when my house is 6 feet underwater, I'm not going to be wishing that I put my money in a more carbon neutral bank. I'm going to need companies that are going to help rebuild my life, and that's what I think a lot of these companies are doing for peoples, for communities, and for nations.
Right. And, I had that question in mind from before we started talking, and I wanted to ask it. But as you've been going through it with me, what I'm seeing is a lot of the companies in the ETF this is not really their main focus necessarily. Like a Home Depot has many other things going on, and they just happen to be associated with this theme as well. So I imagine that's an element as well.
Yeah, in many cases, these companies aren't singularly focused on natural disasters. You do have a company like MSA Safety, which helps, make the helmets that firefighters use and breathing apparatuses and things like that. But, even on, kind of an infrastructure front, one, where you have spending from governments that may happen, whether or not you have a natural disaster, but certainly for rebuilding after a natural disaster, you need construction, hard hats and helmets and things like that for, the individuals that are working on, building new roads or rebuilding old roads. So sometimes you do have overlaps in some of the use cases for some of these companies and their products.
I think the one final point that I wanted to mention is many of the companies that you're mentioning, they're involved in, especially the ones involved in construction and industry. These are also the types of companies that you might worry about when it comes to a recession. And it doesn't seem like we've decided if we're going to have a recession or not in the US or elsewhere in 2024. But I know a lot of people have concerns about that. So any comments that you would make on that note?
Yeah, to the extent that companies are heavily reliant on, municipal, spending, if tax revenues are down, governments have less money to be able to spend. A lot of this goes back to the ounce of cure is worth a pound of prevention equation. And, if you are going to build, there are, constantly, increasing in, demands for what is a passable level or quality, or, what safeguards you have in place when doing new building projects. So some of these companies that are already putting a name in for themselves as far as being, a company that is able to look at things like preparedness for natural disasters, they might have a leg up on companies that aren't necessarily taking that next step to look at, preparedness and sustainability. So, I think a lot of these companies are trying to put themselves in the best position to win these contracts that they can. And looking at, the natural disaster risk and profiles is very important. It's kind of similar like cybersecurity. It's a very important industry. If you're a company, you need cybersecurity protection. You don't know if you're ever going to have a breach, but there may be a breach, and there are many rules and regulations depending on what industry that you're in that you have to spend on some type of cybersecurity. So it's tough to say if there's any floor for these companies in a recession. But when you are, municipality and you're building a new road or you're trying to build hardened infrastructure, things like that, many of these companies are providing solutions to hopefully win some of those contracts.
Very good points. And that's everything that I have for you. I think this has been a really good overview of the ETF, but I'll put it back to you before I let you go and ask if there's any final thoughts that you would leave investors with.
I think this is a product that hasn't necessarily gotten a ton of awareness. So I really appreciate that you're putting this in front of your audience. I think there's a lot of overlap with many people focused on the resource world, which certainly a lot of your audience is. Many people rely on governments or other bodies to help us when disaster strikes. And I think a lot of people that look at resources and things like that are a little bit more familiar with personal preparedness. And I think the way that people invest, the things that they do for their homes, the things that they can do to prepare themselves is really important. I think there's a lot of interesting overlap, and I really appreciate you putting this concept in front of your audience. And if anyone has questions, they can certainly visit our website, procuream.com, and reach out to us, and happy to answer any questions that they might have.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much for going over this. I can really see the overlap between the two industries. So I hope that it does resonate with the audience. Thank you again for being here.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Of course. And once again, I'm Charlotte McLeod with investingnews.com. And this is Founder Chanin.